Imagine a silence. Not just the absence of sound, not the lull between artillery barrages. Imagine a silence that is tangible, heavy as a lead blanket smothering an entire city. A silence that presses on the eardrums with the force of a multi-ton column of seawater, making you feel as if you've plunged to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. This is the silence that follows after God himself has screamed in horror and gone forever hoarse. August 11th, 1945. Somewhere in the ghostly, smoking ruins of what was once an industrial suburb of Nagasaki, a panorama of absolute oblivion unfolds. 5 human figures looking more like shadows vomited up from the depths of hell itself move slowly, tortuously through a milky, unnatural fog of fine ash and radioactive dust that seems as if it will never settle upon the dead, sterilized earth. They are trudging through a world that died 2 days ago, but has not yet realized it. 4 of them are dressed in decaying rags that are barely recognizable as American military uniforms. Their skin, visible through the tears, is covered in terrible sores from burns and a thick layer of gray, sticky grime, making them look like living statues of ash. The 5th, just as emaciated and afflicted by the same ashen leprosy, wears the remnants of an Imperial Japanese Army uniform. At the head of this strange, silent, almost ritualistic procession walks Captain John Miller. His face, once that of a young, hopeful officer from Ohio, has been carved into a granite mask where only unbending will and a bottomless cosmic weariness remain. His gaze has become harder than tempered steel. He looks not at the monstrous ruins, but through them into the void, as if trying to discern something only he can understand. His lips, cracked and bleeding, utter no words because all words, all the languages of the world died with this city. Beside him, barely able to lift his swollen, log-like legs, stumbles Corporal Davis, a former farmer from Oklahoma whose hands once knew only the weight of a plow. In his sunken, feverishly bright eyes there is no longer fear or hatred, only a quiet, viscous madness, born of unbearable thirst and the monstrous realization that he has witnessed the end of the world. Behind them, leaning on a makeshift staff of burnt rebar, shuffles Private Evans, a former medical student from Boston, a man of science and logic. His mind, accustomed to order and classification, desperately clings to scientific terms: thermal radiation, blast wave, acute radiation sickness, trying to find a rational explanation for this apocalypse, but finds only an all-consuming nausea, a leaden weakness spreading through his body like poison, and the bitter, humiliating understanding of his own complete powerlessness in the face of new physics. The last of the Americans is Private Williams, the youngest of them, little more than a boy they found on the second day in the ruins of the infirmary. He isn't walking. He is practically being dragged. His entire body shudders in a fine, unceasing tremor, not from cold, but from an invisible inner fire that has already begun its destructive, irreversible work in his bone marrow. And closing this procession of shadows is Sergeant Ito Kenji. Just a few days ago, he was their jailer, their enemy, a faceless cog in a merciless war machine that was methodically grinding their lives to dust. Today, he is their guide, their compass, their only ghostly hope. His face is as impassive as a traditional no-theater mask, but deep within his eyes, black as a moonless night, the same primal, universal terror is frozen as in the eyes of his former captives. They are united not by forgiveness, not by humanism, not by a sudden epiphany of brotherhood. They are united by thirst, a dull, primal, all-consuming thirst that has scorched everything from their souls except one animal instinct: to find water. Not just any water, but clean water. In this scorched, radioactive hell, where rivers have turned into murky, poisonous streams of filth and bloated corpses, and wells are buried under melted, radiating debris, a single sip of clean water has become more precious than gold, more precious than power, more precious than life itself, and certainly more precious than the hatred that just yesterday divided their nations. They stop at the edge of a wide, vitrified crater that was once a small temple pond where sacred koi carp swam. Now, on its glassy bottom lies an oily film shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow, and a black, dead, poisoned sludge undulates, exuding a nauseating stench. Davis lets out a strangled groan like the howl of a wounded animal and collapses helplessly to his knees, digging his fingers into the warm, radioactive ash. He turns his head and looks at Ito with such undisguised primal hatred that it seems he will gather his last strength, leap, and tear out his throat. But Miller, without a word, places a heavy, grimy hand on his shoulder. There is no sympathy in this gesture, no command. It is the gesture of a man holding another back from the final, most terrible abyss, the abyss of madness. There is no anger in his eyes, no pity. Only the cold, detached, measured calculation of a surgeon deciding which gangrenous limb to amputate to save the whole organism. They are trapped here, enemies turned comrades in misfortune, freed from captivity, but sentenced to a slow, agonizing death, saved by a weapon created by their own country which will kill them more exquisitely and torturously than a Japanese guard's bullet. How did they come to this? How did men, separated by a bottomless ocean of ideologies, propaganda, and barbed wire, end up bound by a single, thin, rotten rope over a chasm? To understand how the steel-willed American captain and the stoic Japanese sergeant forged this unthinkable truce on the ruins of the world, we must go back 3 days, to the very last day of ordinary, predictable life, full of humiliation and quiet, suppressed despair in the Fukuoka II prisoner of war camp, when the sun was still just the sun, and not the harbinger of a fiery man-made apocalypse. August 8th, 1945. The air in Barrack No. 7 was thick, warm and heavy, like damp soldiers' wool soaked in sweat and blood. It was woven from a myriad of smells, each telling its own silent story of suffering. The sour, suffocating stench of hundreds of unwashed, emaciated male bodies rotting alive from vitamin deficiencies. The acrid, bitter smoke of cheap tobacco that the guards lazily smoked at the entrance, watching their charges as they would livestock. The Swedish, corpse-like odor of dysentery wafting from the overflowing infirmary, which was more of an antechamber to the morgue. And finally, that distinct, all-pervading smell of despair, which seemed to seep into the wooden bunks, into the threadbare clothes, into the very skin of the men, becoming an inseparable part of them. Captain John Miller sat on his bunk, his once broad back hunched methodically, almost meditatively, picking through the rice in his chipped wooden bowl. This was a daily, sacred ritual, not a meal. With the same scrupulous, obsessive focus he had once used to study maps of enemy fortifications in the Philippines, he searched the meager, gray portion of rice for small, tooth-like stones, tough husks, and tiny white weevil larvae. Every grain of rice was a treasure, a small pearl of energy to be stretched over 12 endless, hellish hours of grueling labor at the steel mill. Around him, the familiar, memorized tableau of Camp Hell unfolded. Corporal Davis, the hulking farmer from Oklahoma whose shovel-like hands were calloused from earth and toil to the consistency of old oak bark, was cursing quietly, but expertly under his breath, trying to patch another hole in his robe with a makeshift needle fashioned from a fishbone. His hatred for the Japanese wasn't ideological or political. It was deeply personal, almost physiological, like an allergy. He hated them for the suffocating, humid climate that made his body constantly sweat and break out in a painful rash, for their incomprehensible, guttural speech that sounded like the squawking of birds, for the tasteless, slimy rice that gave him indigestion and made him long for potatoes, and most of all, for taking away his simple, clear, boundless Oklahoma sky and his fertile, rich earth. Private Evans, a thin, stooped man from Boston who wore glasses whose lenses had cracked 6 months ago during a beating, creating a bizarre spiderweb before his eyes, was reading and rereading the single, grimy page, worn soft as cloth, torn from a medical textbook on tropical diseases. He knew it by heart, down to the last comma, but the act of reading, of recognizing the familiar Latin letters and scientific terms, calmed him, creating an illusion of order, returning him to that distant, almost unreal world where everything had a Cause and effect, where diseases could be diagnosed and treated, not just helplessly watched as they devoured his comrades from within. In the far darkest corner of the barrack, curled up on a bunk, lay Private Williams, who had barely turned 19. He stared at a single point with unseeing, faded eyes. He barely spoke anymore, his spirit broken by chronic dysentery, starvation, and an all-consuming, childlike homesickness. He was a living reminder of what awaited them all, a walking specter of their shared future. Life in the Fukuoka II camp was a well-oiled, ceaseless machine for grinding human material into dust. The daily routine was carved on their backs in long crimson scars from bamboo canes. Reveille before dawn, to the sharp, guttural shout of a guard. Morning roll call on the parade ground, where they stood for hours under the scorching sun or in the pouring rain while they were counted like cattle. A meager ration of rice and a bowl of murky, warm liquid mockingly called soup. An exhausting march to the factory under guard. 12 hours of hellish, back-breaking labor in the scorching workshops where molten metal hissed and spat fiery sparks, and the air was thick with poisonous fumes that burned the lungs. Then the march back, evening roll call, and another bowl of rice. Death was as commonplace as the sunrise. It came from beriberi, from dysentery, from scurvy, from exhaustion, from an accident at the factory, from the hand of a guard who didn't like the way you looked. The conductor of this orchestra of suffering was Sergeant Ito Kenji. He was not a sadist in the conventional sense of the word. He rarely smiled and seemed to derive no visible pleasure from the beatings. For him, cruelty was not an emotion, but a tool, like a rifle or an order. He was the perfect, flawless product of his militaristic system, a man for whom the concepts of duty, order, and honor were superior to compassion, superior to humanity, superior to his own life. He spoke little. His commands were short and sharp like the slash of a sword. He looked at the prisoners not as men, but as a defective, low-quality resource to be used with maximum efficiency until its final, complete depletion. That evening, August 8th, something new hung in the stale air of the barrack. A vague, underlying anxiety, like a subterranean rumble. The guards were more nervous and jumpy than usual. Their conversations grew quieter, and their blows more frequent and vicious. Rumors of a new, terrible weapon, a bomb of a new type, were spreading among them like a contagion. A weapon the Americans had used 3 days earlier against a city called Hiroshima, wiping it from the face of the earth with a single blow. But to the prisoners, these were just distant, meaningless sounds from another world. What difference did it make which city was burning when your own world had shrunk to the size of a bunk, a bowl of rice, and the dull, gnawing pain in your empty stomach? Miller finished picking through his rice and slowly ate his portion, savoring every grain. He scanned the faces of his men, the broken, the embittered, the quietly fading. His mission was not to win the war. His self-imposed mission was to bring as many of these walking dead men home as possible. He maintained iron discipline, brutally cracking down on food theft, forcing them to wash in icy water to prevent epidemics, and not allowing them to sink into a comforting but deadly apathy. He was the rock against which the waves of their despair crashed. But he could feel that rock slowly, inexorably crumbling under the relentless assault of hopelessness. He lay down on his bunk, folded his hands behind his head, and closed his eyes, trying to summon the face of his wife, her smile, the scent of her hair. But the images blurred, pushed aside by visions of the factory workshop, of molten metal, and the gaunt gray faces of his comrades. He did not know that this was the last night of the old, comprehensible, albeit cruel world. He did not know that tomorrow would bring not the long-awaited liberation they prayed for every night, but something far worse. Something that would erase the line between victor and vanquished, between jailer and prisoner, and cast them all into one common white-hot crucible. He fell asleep to the monotonous, nagging drone of malarial mosquitoes, unaware that the roar he would hear tomorrow morning would not be the sound of another bombing raid, but the death scream of the city of Nagasaki itself. August 9th, 1945. 11:01 a.m. local time. The sky over the Urakami Valley, where Nagasaki was located, was clear, almost cloudless, contrary to the weather forecast. Perfect conditions for a visual bombing run. The prisoners, like on any other day of this seemingly endless captivity, were toiling at the Mitsubishi steelworks. The heat in the workshops was unbearable, hellish. The searing metal of the massive blast furnaces mixed with the suffocating near 100% humidity of the Japanese summer, creating the atmosphere of a giant steam room where every breath burned the lungs, and sweat, beading on the skin, didn't evaporate but streamed down, mixing with metal dust and grime. Captain Miller, along with Davis and a few other prisoners, was straining his last reserves of strength to haul a heavy steel beam, scorching hot from the sun. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging them into red patches. His muscles burned from the inhuman effort, and a constant drone from the monotonous clang of the factory hammers filled his ears. Miller saw William swaying beside him, his face an unhealthy, earthy, almost gray color. The boy wouldn't last long. Maybe a week, maybe 2. The thought was cold, detached, and ordinary, like the thought that the sun would rise again tomorrow. Sergeant Ito stood on a small platform, a bridge overlooking the workshop, observing the work with the impassive expression of a plantation overseer. His figure was tense, like a katana string. He shouted something sharp to another guard, pointing his bamboo cane at the clear, serene sky. Suddenly, with a heart-wrenching, soul-tearing wail, the air raid siren began to scream. This was not unusual. The B-29 bombers, which the prisoners had grimly and ironically nicknamed B-San, Mr. B, had become frequent visitors in the skies over Japan. Usually it meant a short, blessed break from work as they hid in wretched, cramped, musty-smelling bomb shelters dug right on the factory grounds. But this time was different. The siren wailed with a desperate, hysterical, panicked tone, like a living creature screaming in unbearable terror. The guards began to run about, their shouts filled not with the usual feigned fury, but with genuine, animal fear. They herded the prisoners toward the shelter, jabbing their rifles into their backs, but Miller managed to cast a quick, sharp glance at the sky. High above, almost invisible in the blinding sunlight, he spotted a lone silver plane, like a tiny cross. Not an armada of dozens of planes as usual, but just one. It was strange. And in the next second, the world exploded. There was no sound of an explosion, like in a normal bombing. First, there was light. A wrong, unearthly, blasphemous light. Imagine a second sun being ignited inside the first, 1,000 times brighter and more cruel. This light was not yellow or white. It was magnesium bright, blinding, all-pervading. It penetrated closed eyelids, burning the retinas. It flooded all space, erasing shadows, colors, the outlines of objects, turning the material world into the negative of a horrific photograph. For one unbearably long, infinite fraction of a second, Miller saw the skeletons of his comrades through their own flesh, which had become transparent for an instant, like on an X-ray. Then came the wave of heat. It was not the heat of a fire, but an all-pervading, incinerating, instantaneous heat, as if someone had thrown open the door to a blast furnace the size of the sky. The air instantly became a scorching, suffocating gas. The clothes on people's backs began to smolder and stick to their skin, which instantly blistered as if scalded with boiling water. And only after that, with a delay, as if reluctantly, came the sound. But it was not a sound. It was an impact. A physical, crushing blow, as if the invisible hand of an angry god had swept the entire city away, like a child sweeping a house of cards from a table. The shockwave ripped the massive roof from the factory building like a lid from a tin can, hurling it, twisted into a spiral hundreds of meters away. Thick steel trusses, which had seemed eternal, bent like blades of grass in a hurricane. Walls crumbled, turning into giant clouds of dust, brick, and concrete. Miller was thrown to the ground with such force that all the air was knocked from his lungs. He was deafened. The world devolved into a primal, blind chaos of roaring, screaming, the screech of tearing metal, and the crack of collapsing structures. He lost consciousness. When he came to, a crimson alien twilight reigned. The air was filled with a thick, choking dust that clogged his nose and throat and tasted of bitter chalk and ash. Through this veil, a strange, orange-purple light filtered through. The burning ruins of the city. Somewhere in the distance, as if in another world, fire tornadoes raged, sucking up debris and ash. Miller sat up, struggling to focus his eyes. He felt himself over. He was alive, deafened, concussed, with numerous cuts and bruises, but alive. Bodies lay all around, mutilated, burned, buried under rubble. Some were dead. Others moaned softly, begging for help or for death. He saw Davis trying to crawl out from under a pile of twisted metal, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Evans lay nearby, his glasses shattered, a thin stream of blood trickling from his ear. Miller crawled over to him, felt for a pulse in his neck. Weak, intermittent, but there. He looked around for Williams. The boy lay under a massive, bent beam, his eyes wide open and staring at the non-existent sky. But there was no life left in them. Miller felt a dull, aching pain in his chest, but he didn't allow himself time to grieve. He had to act. He helped Davis get free. The corporal was in deep shock, muttering nonsensically about the end of the world and God's punishment. And then, a few meters away, someone else began to rise slowly, like a ghost, from under a pile of debris. It was Sergeant Ito. His uniform was torn to shreds, his face covered in blood, and a jagged piece of rebar protruded from his shoulder. But he was alive. Their eyes met in this dim, dying world. For one long, infinite moment, there was nothing in them. No hatred, no fear, no malice. Only the mute, primal astonishment of two beings who had survived what no one was ever meant to survive. The walls of their prison had fallen, the factory, the camp, the entire city. Everything had turned into smoking ruins. They were free. But this was freedom in hell. Miller looked at his two surviving men, then at his former jailer, and in that moment, he knew. If they wanted to live even one more day, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become for them what Ito had been, the keeper of order and chaos, even if that order had to be carved from bone and despair. The first few hours after the explosion were like a feverish, incoherent nightmare from which it was impossible to wake. The world was plunged into an unnatural crimson twilight, though it was midday. A gigantic mushroom cloud of dust, ash, and vaporized earth, having risen 18 kilometers, about 11 miles above the city, blotted out the sun, painting everything in apocalyptic crimson-purple tones, as if from a surrealist painting. The air, thick and heavy as syrup, was filled with a nauseating multi-layered smell of burning, of scorched flesh, of burnt rubber, and something else. Something unfamiliar, sharp, chemical, that made the throat raw and the eyes water. The silence that followed the hellish roar of destruction was even more terrifying. It rang in the ears, pressed on the psyche, creating a sense of vacuum. It was broken only by the distant guttural crackle of raging fires, the mournful howl of wind through the ruins, and the quiet, barely audible moans of the dying, like the mewing of kittens, scattered throughout the factory grounds. Miller, Davis, and Evans huddled together by the remains of a concrete wall, instinctively seeking protection in each other, like frightened children. They tried to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe, but the human mind, designed for simpler tasks, refused to accept and process the scene. Evans, despite a severe concussion and bleeding from his ear that left him nearly deaf on one side, was trying to give first aid to Davis, who had a deep, ragged wound on his leg from which dark, thick blood oozed slowly but steadily. But he had nothing but scraps of his own dirty robe to bandage it with. Davis sat on the ground rocking back and forth, his eyes vacant and senseless, unresponsive to the pain. Shock had erased all his bravado and hatred, leaving only the trembling, terrified shell of a man who had looked into hell. Sergeant Ito sat apart, leaning against the remains of the wall to keep from falling. With the inhuman, samurai-like stoicism he had been taught since childhood, he was trying to pull the jagged piece of rebar from his own shoulder. His face was stone pale, a cold sweat beading on his forehead, but he did not make a single sound. Not a single groan, considering it a shameful weakness. Miller watched him, a tense, feverish struggle raging in his stunned mind. The enemy, the jailer, the man who had starved them, beaten them with canes, and humiliated them, the man who embodied everything he hated about this war. The first instinct dictated by years of war was to finish him, or just walk away and leave him to die a painful death. Davis would have done so without a doubt had he been in his right mind. But Miller was an officer, a commander. His mind, accustomed to analyzing situations and making difficult, often cruel decisions, had already begun to work, casting aside emotions as useless ballast. They were at the epicenter of something terrible, something that went beyond their understanding of war. They didn't know what it was, but they instinctively understood that rescue was not coming. For miles around there was only death, fire, and destruction. They were alone, and this Japanese man, their enemy, possibly held the only key to their survival. He knew this area. He knew where there might be water sources, where they could find shelter from the fire and wind. In this new inverted world, hatred was an unaffordable luxury that could cost them their lives. Evans was the first to speak, breaking the oppressive silence. His voice was hoarse, weak, and uncertain like a child's. "Captain, what was that? A bomb? But what the hell kind of bomb can do this?" Miller slowly shook his head. "I don't know, son. It doesn't matter now. The only thing that matters is what we do next." He struggled to his feet and, swaying, took a few steps toward Ito. The Japanese man tensed, his free hand instinctively reaching for his belt, where his Nambu pistol holster used to be. But the holster was gone, torn away by the blast wave. Miller stopped 2 paces from him. He didn't know Japanese, and Ito knew only a few commands in broken English. But now, words were unnecessary. The language of survival is universal and understood by any living creature. Miller pointed to the wound in Ito's shoulder, then to Evans, who was a medic. Then he cupped his hand and brought it to his mouth, mimicking drinking. "Water," he said slowly and distinctly, looking the Japanese man straight in the eye. "Water. Mizu." Ito stared at him for a long time, his gaze heavy, impenetrable, like embers in a dying fire. In his mind, decades of upbringing, his oath to the emperor, the code of Bushido, his hatred for the enemy, and the most ancient, most primal instinct, the survival instinct, were at war. He saw before him not an American officer, not an enemy, but a man just like himself, wounded, stunned, dying of thirst on the very edge of ruin. He slowly, with visible effort, nodded. It was not a sign of friendship. It was a contract. A non-aggression pact, signed on the ashes of civilization. Evans, understanding the captain's silent order, crawled over to Ito. He carefully examined the wound. The rebar hadn't gone deep, but the edges of the wound were torn and dirty. Pulling it out was risky. It could cause severe bleeding they couldn't stop. "We need something to bandage this, and something to cauterize or at least disinfect the wound," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. They began to search the ruins around them. Soon, they had an incredible, almost divine stroke of luck. Under the rubble, they found the intact first aid kit of one of the dead guards. Inside were sterile bandages, a small bottle of iodine, and most importantly, an almost full canteen of water. It was a treasure more valuable than all the diamonds in the world. Miller's hands trembled as he unscrewed the cap. He took one small, blessed sip, wetting his parched throat and cracked lips. Then he passed the canteen to Evans. He drank and passed it to Davis. Davis greedily pressed his lips to the canteen's mouth, but Miller harshly snatched it from his hands. "One sip each," he growled. "We don't know when we'll find more." He walked over to Ito and held out the canteen. The Japanese man hesitated for a moment, but thirst was stronger than pride and hatred. He too took a sip. In that very moment, as they shared the last drops of water among themselves, the old world finally died. There were no more prisoners and guards, victors and vanquished. All that remained was a group of 4 men trying to survive in hell. Evans, using the iodine, generously doused the Japanese man's wound. Then Miller and Davis, following his instructions, gripped the rebar and pulled it out sharply. Ito let out a strangled gasp, his body arching. But again, he did not scream. Evans tightly bandaged the wound. Their first joint operation was a success. But this was only the beginning. There was almost no water left in the canteen. And as darkness fell, a strange, black rain began to fall from the sky. Large, greasy, sticky drops left dirty stains on their skin. They didn't know it was radioactive fallout, but instinct told them this water was not safe to drink. They needed to find shelter and clean water urgently, and they had to do it before this new, nightmarish, poison world consumed them completely. Thirst is a quiet, methodical, and sophisticated killer. It doesn't arrive suddenly, like a bullet or a shell fragment. It creeps up slowly, unnoticed, drying you out from the inside, cell by cell. First, the lips dry and crack. Then the tongue swells and turns into a rough piece of sandpaper that's impossible to move. Thoughts become confused, viscous and sticky like molasses, focusing on a single, all-consuming, almost hallucinatory desire. The image of water, the memory of its taste, its coolness, the feeling of it flowing down a parched throat. For the 4 survivors on the smoking ruins of Nagasaki, thirst became the primary enemy, more real and terrifying than the invisible radiation they did not yet know about. The last drops from the dead guard's canteen had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste and an even sharper, almost painful desire to drink. They moved through the destroyed alien landscape that just that morning had been a living, bustling city. The scenery was unreal, surreal, as if taken from a painting by Hieronymus Bosch or Salvador Dali. The skeletons of concrete buildings reached for the leaden, ash-shrouded sky like the bony hands of the dead begging for mercy. The ground was covered with a thick, several-centimeter layer of gray, fine ash, like powder, that crunched underfoot and filled the lungs with every breath. Sometimes, the melted remains of people could be seen under the ash, frozen at the moment of death in bizarre, unnatural poses, like actors in a horrific play. Davis constantly stumbled, his wounded leg aching and swollen, his mind clouded by shock and progressive dehydration. He began to ramble, muttering about a cool stream near his farm in Oklahoma, where he used to fish as a boy. Miller and Evans dragged him along, supporting him on both sides, barely able to move their own legs. Ito walked ahead. He moved slowly but steadily, his knowledge of the area not erased, along with the houses and streets. He led them up a hillside, away from the destroyed center toward the outskirts. He said something in Japanese, pointing ahead with his good arm. Miller didn't understand the words, but he caught the main thing in his tone. Hope. Finally, after several hours of agonizing travel, they stumbled upon what they were looking for. An old stone well near the ruins of a Buddhist temple that had been razed to its foundations. But their joy was premature. The well was blocked by heavy rubble from the roof and debris. Their attempts to clear the blockage with weakened hands were futile. Despair, which had briefly receded, began to thicken around them again, cold and sticky. And it was at this moment that Evans, the quiet, unassuming medical student, stepped up. He was not a soldier. He didn't know how to fight or survive in the wild. His body was weak, but his main weapon was his mind. Trained by years of study, accustomed to analysis, synthesis, and finding unconventional solutions. He walked around the temple ruins, carefully examining everything he could find. His gaze, even through his cracked glasses, was sharp. He noticed several long, charred, but sturdy bamboo poles that had survived the fire, and a large piece of heavy canvas, torn from some military truck by the blast wave. "Captain," he said, his voice weak but tinged with scientific excitement. "I think I know what to do. We can't get the water from below, from the well, but we can try to collect what's in the air. Condensation." The principle is simple. His idea was both simple and brilliant in their desperate situation. At night, the air temperature drops. The humidity, especially after the recent black rain, was very high. If they stretched the canvas at a certain angle to the ground, moisture from the air would condense on its surface overnight, and due to gravity, would drip down to a single point. It wouldn't be much, just a few sips for each of them, but it would be clean, distilled water. It was their only chance. Miller, whose mind was more practical but no less sharp, immediately recognized the genius of the idea. He gave a short command, and they set to work. Davis, forgetting his pain and apathy, helped clear the area of small debris with a furious, desperate energy. Ito, using his innate knowledge of bamboo, showed them how to properly split the poles with a knife found on a dead soldier to make a strong and light frame. They worked together, in silence, understanding each other without words. An American, a Japanese, a farmer, a student. 4 men whom war had made mortal enemies were now building their own small Noah's Ark, their primitive but vital apparatus for producing water. They stretched the canvas, securing it to the bamboo supports. Under the lower sagging edge, they placed the only surviving helmet. This was their first conscious collective victory over circumstances. Not over an enemy of flesh and blood, but over death itself, over the merciless element their world had become. This small, flimsy, ugly construction of junk and rubble became a symbol of their indomitable will to live. They weren't just waiting for rescue. They had begun to save themselves, using their wits and whatever they could find. As darkness fell, they climbed into the cellar of the ruined temple, which served as their shelter. The night chill pierced them to the bone. They sat in complete, impenetrable darkness, huddled together for warmth. No one spoke. They just sat and listened as the rare, heavy drops fell from the canvas into the metal helmet. Drip, drip, drip. In the deafening silence of the dead city, this sound was the most beautiful music in the world. It was the sound of hope, the sound of their first victory. But they didn't know that this victory, this small, ingenious invention of theirs, had attracted more than just life-saving moisture. In the ruins where hundreds of thousands had died, they were not the only survivors. In the shadows of the destroyed city, others were hiding, and those others were also thirsty. They were hungry, and they had already smelled the living. The first drops of water collected from the canvas at dawn tasted like life itself. There was a pitifully small amount, just half a helmet's worth of a cloudy liquid that smelled of soot and ash. But for men whose bodies were desiccated to the extreme, it was a divine nectar, an elixir of immortality. Miller established a strict, almost prison-like order. 2 sips each, no more. He measured out the dose himself, passing the helmet from hand to hand. Davis, his eyes burning with a greedy fire, tried to object, but one heavy steel-like glare from the captain was enough to silence him. This small victory, this first water they had procured, breathed new strength into them, giving them something more than just quenching their thirst. It gave them a purpose. In the morning, they felt not just like lucky survivors, but like builders of a new, tiny world. Their empire was microscopic. A dark, damp cellar of a ruined temple and a primitive condenser on the surface. But it was their world, with their laws, their hierarchy, and their order. Miller became the undisputed leader, a kind of dictator of this small state. His decisions were not questioned because everyone instinctively understood that their lives depended on them. He was stern, but fair. He knew that in their situation, any weakness, any concession to panic, egoism, or despair would be tantamount to a death sentence for the whole group. He introduced a strict daily routine, scheduled by the hour, at dawn. The collection and distribution of the precious moisture. Then, forays for resources. 2 always remained in the camp, guarding the water and shelter, while the other two went out to search. Evans became their Minister of Health and Science. He tirelessly monitored the condition of the wounded. Davis and Ito, changing their dressings made from scraps of clothing. He constantly improved their water collection system, experimenting with the angle of the canvas and trying to find a way to filter the water through charcoal from their fire. He even started keeping a kind of scientific journal on a piece of burnt bark, scratching symbols with a sharp stone. He recorded his observations, symptoms, ideas. It helped him maintain his sanity and not go mad from the horror and absurdity of the surrounding reality. Davis, whose leg was beginning to heal thanks to Evans's care, became their enforcer. His immense physical strength was indispensable when clearing rubble in search of food or useful items. Miller skillfully channeled his blind aggression and hatred into a constructive outlet, giving him the hardest and most dangerous tasks. Work helped Davis not to think, not to remember. Ito became the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Intelligence. He was their eyes and ears in this hostile world. He knew where food depots had been located, where they could try to find canned goods or bags of rice. He taught them to recognize edible, though bitter roots that were beginning to push through the layer of ash. He explained that the strange dark shadows they saw everywhere on the surviving walls of buildings were atomic shadows, silhouettes of people and objects permanently seared into the stone at the moment of the flash. His knowledge was priceless. Miller, casting aside all prejudice, understood that without the Japanese men, their chances of survival would be zero. A strange, silent, almost business-like relationship developed between them, based on mutual respect for each other's professionalism and fortitude. They were still enemies by definition, but here, on the ruins, all old definitions had lost their meaning. Their small society functioned surprisingly well. On the third day, they found several cans of preserved vegetables in the ruins of a grocery store. They learned to make fire using a lens from a broken pair of binoculars Evans had found. They had water, a little food, and a reliable shelter. A routine emerged, and routine gave the illusion of stability, the illusion of control. They even began to talk, overcoming the language barrier. Evans, using his journal, tried to teach Ito simple English words, and Ito, in turn, showed them kanji characters, drawing them with a stick in the ash. These were the first fragile shoots of human communication, pushing through the thick concrete of hatred and war. But it was this very stability, this predictability, that created the first crack in their fragile alliance. Davis, receiving regular food and water, began to recover physically and mentally, and with his strength, his old ingrained hatred returned. He watched with suspicion as Miller consulted with Ito, as they planned the next foray together using gestures and drawings. And in his simple, straightforward soul, a black jealousy and suspicion began to brew. He couldn't and wouldn't forget that this man in a Japanese uniform had been their tormentor just a few days ago. He didn't believe in his selfless help. He was sure Ito was hiding something, leading them on for his own obscure and undoubtedly treacherous purposes. He began to challenge Miller's decisions, at first in a whisper, behind his back, then louder and more brazenly. "Why should we listen to him?" he hissed to Evans at night when Miller and Ito were asleep. "He's lying to us. He probably knows where the real food and water are hidden, and he's feeding us scraps and bitter roots. Miller's gone completely crazy if he trusts that slant-eyed bastard." The seeds of doubt and hatred sown by Davis began to sprout poisonous shoots. The stale air of their cellar began to smell of enmity again. Their little empire, built on ash and despair, was now threatened not from without, but from within. In the darkness of their shelter, a mutiny was brewing. A mutiny born not of hunger or thirst, but of old, ineradicable hatred which, as it turned out, was more resilient than the apocalypse itself. The conflict brewed slowly but inevitably, like an abscess under the skin. Davis stopped obeying Miller's orders directly. He did everything with a deliberate slowness, with a defiant, sullen expression, constantly casting sideways glances full of hatred at Ito. He began to actively work on Evans, who was morally weaker, playing on his fatigue and deep-seated fear. "Look at him," he'd say, nodding at the Japanese man, who was silently and methodically repairing their bamboo frame, damaged by the night wind. He works like an ox and barely eats. He's up to something, I'm telling you. Maybe he's waiting for us to get weaker so he can slit our throats in our sleep and take all the water for himself. At first, Evans brushed it off, trying to appeal to logic, but Davis's constant pressure and the overall oppressive atmosphere took their toll. The seeds of mistrust were already sown in his tormented soul. He too began to watch Ito with suspicion, trying to decipher the thoughts hidden behind his impenetrable stone mask. The climax came on the 5th day of their shared survival, a day that could have been their last. Miller, Ito, and Evans returned from another foray that had been almost fruitless. They brought back only a handful of burnt rice they'd found in the ruins of a warehouse that had burned to the ground. Davis, who had stayed at the camp, met them with a strange, malicious, and triumphant smirk on his face. "While you guys were digging around in shit, I found something better," he declared defiantly. He led them around the corner of the ruined temple and showed them his discovery. A small stream was trickling out from under a pile of stones. The water in it looked perfectly clear and transparent, gurgling cheerfully as it flowed into a small pit. "There!" Davis shouted triumphantly, pointing at the stream. "Real, living water! A whole stream! And we're drinking that stinking piss off a tarp like idiots. I told you he was deceiving us." He spun around and jabbed a finger right in Ito's face. "He knew about this stream. 100% he knew and kept quiet. He wanted us to die of thirst while he drank in secret." Ito shook his head and said one of the few English words he knew. "No. Bad. Danger." He tried to explain with gestures that this water was dangerous, that it flowed from the very center of the destruction, that it carried death. But Davis wouldn't listen. His eyes burned with a fanatical, insane fire. He saw in this stream irrefutable proof of all his darkest suspicions. He dropped to his knees, scooped up a handful of the clear, cool water, and drank it greedily, looking defiantly at the others. "See? I'm drinking it. And nothing. You can keep trusting your Jap." Miller knew this was the critical moment, the point of no return. If he didn't turn the situation around now, their group would fall apart. Panic and mutual distrust would destroy them faster than any radiation. He calmly walked over to Davis. "Corporal." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it rang with such steel that Davis flinched involuntarily. "You have violated my direct order not to drink from unverified sources. You have endangered not only your own life, but the lives of every one of us. From this moment on, you are relieved of all duties. You will receive your share of water and food, but you will remain in camp under my personal supervision." "Who the hell are you to give me orders?" Davis roared, jumping to his feet. "There are no captains or corporals here anymore. It's every man for himself." He took a threatening step toward Miller, clenching his huge fists. In that moment, Miller employed what would later be called, in survival psychology textbooks, the principle of surgical cruelty. He didn't fight Davis. He did something far worse. Calmly, under the astonished gazes of Evans and Ito, he walked over to their condenser, their only source of proven safe water. And with one powerful, calculated kick, he smashed the flimsy bamboo structure. The helmet with the precious water collected overnight overturned, and the water was instantly absorbed by the gray, insatiable ash. Evans gasped in horror. Even Ito's stoic face twitched. Davis froze in place, unable to believe his eyes. What have you done, you madman?" he croaked. "Me?" Miller replied coldly, almost indifferently, looking him straight in the eyes. "It wasn't me. It was you, Corporal. You just destroyed our only source of life. Now, if you want to drink, go and drink from your stream, or help us build a new condenser. The choice is yours. But if you choose the stream, you'll be doing it alone, far away from here." It was a cruel but brilliant psychological move. Miller hadn't just punished a mutineer. With shocking clarity, he forced him and everyone else to realize how fragile their lives were, and how much they depended on each other and the system he had built. He showed them that anarchy and insubordination meant a swift and certain death, while order, even the harshest and most dictatorial, was their only chance to survive. Davis was morally broken. He looked from Miller's crazed eyes to the wet patch in the ash at his feet. His rebellion had drowned in despair. He slowly, like an old man, sank to his knees and whispered, I'll help. The internal enemy had been defeated. Their small society had withstood its first and most serious test. Miller had upheld his law. But while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice that their real, primary, and invisible enemy, which had entered their bodies in the first minutes after the explosion, was preparing its final, devastating blow. Davis had drunk from the stream, and that crystal clear, but mortally poisonous, water had begun its quiet, destructive work inside his body. After the brutal but necessary suppression of the mutiny, life in their small enclave returned to a harsh, predictable routine. The four of them worked together to rebuild their condenser, making it even stronger and more reliable than before. Davis worked harder and more silently than anyone, his feverish diligence a form of atonement. It seemed the crisis was over, and their fragile, unnatural alliance had been strengthened in the face of a common calamity. But the enemy they were about to face was invisible, insidious, and utterly merciless. It didn't attack from the outside with a cry of "Banzai!" It grew from within, from the very depths of their cells, like a poisonous vine. The first to fall ill was not Davis, who had drunk the contaminated water. The first to break was the youngest and weakest, Private Williams, whom they had found on the second day, concussed and dehydrated, and brought to their camp. Until that moment, they had considered his rescue a true miracle. Now that miracle was turning into a slow, agonizing curse before their eyes. It began with fits of uncontrollable nausea and vomiting. At first, they thought it was food poisoning from the questionable canned goods. Evans gave him some charcoal, which they used to filter water, but it didn't help in the slightest. Then Williams's hair began to fall out. He would simply run a hand through his hair, and entire clumps of dull, lifeless strands would come away in his palm. A couple of days later, his head was completely bald and covered in red splotches. His skin took on an unhealthy, waxy, almost transparent hue, and deep dark circles formed under his eyes, turning his young face into a death mask. He grew weaker by the hour, his body consumed by a vicious fever that none of Evans's known methods could break. Evans, the former medical student, watched the symptoms with professional horror, unable to fit them into any known disease pattern. He frantically searched his memory, flipping through the pages of dozens of textbooks he had read, but found no answer. He saw before him a man being devoured from the inside by something against which all of his Western medicine was powerless. It was like the plague, but without a pathogen. Then Davis fell ill. His symptoms were even more aggressive and frightening. In addition to the uncontrollable nausea and weakness, spontaneous bleeding from his gums and nose began. Strange purple spots like huge bruises appeared on his skin, especially on his legs, forming at the slightest touch. The water from the stream, saturated with radioactive isotopes, had delivered a devastating blow directly to his bone marrow, destroying his platelets and robbing his blood of its ability to clot. Miller and Ito watched with a silent, bone-chilling horror. They were strong men, hardened by battle. They knew how to fight an enemy you could see, hear, and kill. But how do you fight an invisible death that hides in the water, in the air, in the very ash beneath your feet? Their little empire, their well-oiled survival system was utterly powerless against this new, incomprehensible plague. All their systems, all their order, all their unbending will to live, shattered against the deaf wall of this quiet, methodical decay. The most terrifying part was the overwhelming sense of helplessness. They could only watch as their comrades died a slow, agonizing death, knowing that the same fate awaited them. Ito, seeing their suffering, made a desperate attempt. He left for several hours into the ruined city and returned with a bundle of some unknown herbs. He crushed them with stones, brewed a bitter, foul-smelling concoction, and tried to make Williams drink it. He knew perfectly well it was likely useless, but it was a gesture of desperation, an attempt to do something, to pit the ancient knowledge of his ancestors' healing herbs against the new, technological horror born of war. Williams died on the 7th day after the explosion. He died quietly, in his sleep, without a struggle. His death was not heroic, not a soldier's death. It was quiet, pathetic, and all the more terrifying for it. He simply stopped breathing. They buried him under a pile of stones so his body wouldn't be dragged away by the stray dogs, which were becoming more numerous. His death was the point of no return for them. They finally understood that time was working against them, that every new day in this cursed place was another lethal dose of poison. The hope that still flickered in their souls began to fade rapidly, replaced by a cold, animal determination to survive at any cost. Davis, knowing he was dying and realizing it was his own fault, fell into a deep apathy. He lay in a corner of the cellar refusing food and water. His hatred had evaporated, leaving behind only a vast, all-consuming, gut-wrenching guilt. He looked at Miller with cloudy eyes and whispered with parched lips, "Sorry, Captain. I didn't mean to. I was a fool." Miller sat silently beside him, holding his hand. He didn't know what to say. All words of comfort seemed empty and meaningless in the face of this slow, inevitable agony. And it was at that very moment, in their darkest hour of despair, when it seemed all was lost and they could only wait their turn, that fate dealt them its final, most cruel and ironic card. Evans, who was staggering from weakness while standing guard at the entrance to the cellar, suddenly let out a hoarse cry. But it was not a cry of terror or pain. It was a cry of absolute, disbelieving amazement. Miller and Ito rushed outside. On the crest of the neighboring hill, in the rays of the setting crimson sun, they saw several dark figures, men, in military uniforms. And on the flagpole they carried, a flag was slowly unfurling, the stars and stripes of the United States of America. Salvation had arrived. The euphoria was short, blinding and painful, like a magnesium flare. One unbearable moment of absolute, almost animalistic happiness when they saw their own, when they realized this endless nightmare was finally over. Miller, Evans, and even the reserved Ito screamed, waved their arms, raw, inhuman sounds tearing from their chests to attract attention. The Marines, a forward reconnaissance patrol, cautiously descended the hill, clutching their rifles, their young, healthy faces a mixture of shock, horror, and disgust at the apocalyptic landscape, and the three ragged, emaciated figures covered in a thick layer of gray ash, looking more like the risen dead. The first to reach them was a young, clean-cut lieutenant who smelled of soap and tobacco, as if he had arrived from another, parallel, normal world. He looked at them with unconcealed disbelief, trying to see the men beneath the layer of filth. "Are you Americans?" he asked, instinctively wrinkling his nose at the smell of sickness and decay that emanated from them. "Captain John Miller," Miller reported, gathering his last vestiges of strength and straightening up. "Private Evans, we have one more, seriously wounded, in the shelter." The lieutenant nodded, his gaze flicking to the silently standing Ito. And in that moment, the brief euphoria ended, shattered against the cold, implacable steel of reality. "And who is this?" the lieutenant asked, his voice instantly becoming hard and icy. Two Marines immediately, as if on command, leveled their rifles at Ito. "This is Sergeant Ito," Miller began to explain hastily, feeling a chill creep up his spine. He helped us survive. He saved us." The lieutenant gave a cynical smirk. "Helped, you say?" "Sergeant, he's telling us you helped him. Is that true?" Ito remained silent, staring at the ground. He understood everything in an instant. To these new, clean, strong men, he was not a comrade in misfortune, not a savior, not a human being. He was once again the enemy, a prisoner, a war criminal. "Take him," the lieutenant ordered curtly. The Marines roughly twisted Ito's arms behind his back, wrenching his injured shoulder, and shoved him forcefully to his knees in the radioactive ash. Miller stepped forward, fighting through his weakness. "Lieutenant, you don't understand. This man saved our lives. We would have died of thirst without him. He shared his last with us." "Calm down, Captain," the lieutenant cut him off, his voice condescending as if speaking to a man who had lost his mind from the horrors he'd endured. "Stockholm Syndrome. We know all about it. Don't worry, we'll deal with him according to the full extent of military law. You and your men need urgent medical attention and decontamination." And that was the end. Their brotherhood, born in atomic fire, forged by shared thirst and fear, was destroyed by a single short order, a single line in the military code. They were once again separated by an insurmountable wall of uniforms, ranks, and hatred. Miller and Evans were led to a temporary camp set up on the hilltop. As they passed Ito, who was kneeling with his hands tied behind his back, their eyes met for the last time. There was no resentment in the Japanese man's gaze, no hatred, no fear, only a deep, cosmic, infinite weariness. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow, not as a soldier of an enemy army, but as one human being saying goodbye to another with whom he had shared something greater than life. Miller wanted to scream, to fight, to argue, but he was too weak. The apathy born of the invisible disease was already beginning to take hold of his body and will. At the camp, they were met by medics in hazmat suits. They were stripped, their clothes burned. They were scrubbed long and humiliatingly with brushes, treated with some kind of solutions. They were given clean clothes, hot food, and water. They had been pulled from hell, but the collision with the real world proved to be no less brutal and shocking. They were interrogated. An intelligence officer with cold, colorless eyes listened methodically and dispassionately to Miller's rambling account of their survival, of Evans's brilliant idea, of Ito's help, of the black rain, of the strange and terrible sickness. He nodded, took notes in his pad, but his eyes held an open, cynical disbelief. The story was too incredible, too cinematic. American POWs surviving the first ever atomic bomb in a close alliance with their cruel jailer. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, or even worse, a cunning attempt to protect the enemy. Davis, who was unconscious, and the other survivors found in the camp ruins were urgently evacuated to a hospital ship. Miller and Evans were also prepared for evacuation. Before leaving, Miller made one last desperate attempt. He found the lieutenant. "What will happen to Sergeant Ito?" he asked. "That Jap? He'll be sent to a POW camp. There'll be a trial. Probably hang him. He was a guard at a death camp, Captain. Under international law, he's a war criminal." "But he saved us. He's a man of honor," Miller almost shouted. "Your testimony will be taken into account," the lieutenant replied indifferently, averting his gaze, then added more quietly, almost in a whisper. "If they believe it, of course. Now get some rest, Captain. The war is over for you." In that moment, Miller finally understood. They had survived physically, but their story, their shared truth, their small but great act of humanity in the midst of the apocalypse, all of it would be buried under a classified stamp, erased, distorted, declared a fabrication. Their rescue had turned into a new, even more sophisticated prison, a prison of silence. Victory had the bitter taste of ash and betrayal. Their unique, priceless experience, which should have been a major lesson for all of humanity, turned out to be a truth too inconvenient, too complex for a world that was rushing to divide itself once again into black and white, into victors and vanquished. The fates of the heroes of this forgotten drama, played out on the smoking ashes of Nagasaki and erased from history, proved to be as tragic and unjust as their so-called liberation. They were taken from the scorched, poison land of Japan, but they carried its invisible, deadly venom with them forever, in their blood, in their bones, in their souls. Captain John Miller and Private Evans were taken to a military hospital on Guam. They were interrogated at length, in detail, and with humiliation. Their story of surviving with Sergeant Ito was meticulously recorded, but the investigators, men with cold eyes and stone hearts, treated it with unconcealed skepticism. The final official report dryly and laconically stated that a group of American prisoners of war had managed to survive the atomic bombing due to a fortunate coincidence and their presence in a sturdy cellar that protected them from the main blast. Wave and thermal radiation. The role of the Japanese sergeant was minimized. He was just another survivor, discovered with them and immediately taken prisoner. Their act of humanity was deemed inappropriate, their truth dangerous and detrimental to morale. The story of American soldiers fraternizing with the enemy, even for survival, did not fit into the heroic, poster-perfect narrative of the great victory. They were forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement binding them for life. Their brotherhood, their shared secret, their 7 days in hell were buried in the dusty archives of the Pentagon, stamped top secret. Corporal Davis died 3 weeks after his rescue in a hospital ward aboard the USS Mercy. He never regained consciousness. The aggressive dose of radiation he had received from the poison stream, combined with the general exposure, had completely destroyed his body from the inside. He died in a sterile white room, thousands of miles from his farm in Oklahoma and the cool stream he had dreamt of in his final delirium. His death was officially attributed to complications arising from prolonged exhaustion and malnutrition in Japanese captivity. Private Evans, the former medical student, lived longer than the others. His scientific, analytical mind tried until the very end to understand the nature of the invisible killer that had taken root in him. He read extensively about the effects of radiation, becoming one of the first to study the subject not in theory, but from his own experience. He kept a detailed journal of his symptoms, trying to help science unravel this new plague of the 20th century. He died of acute leukemia 2 years after the war, in a Boston hospital. He was only 24 years old. His notes were confiscated and classified. Captain Miller proved to be the strongest, or perhaps the luckiest. He returned home to a small, quiet town in Ohio. He tried desperately to live a normal, peaceful life. He married his pre-war sweetheart who had waited for him all those years. They had a daughter. But the war and the 7 days in Nagasaki never let him go. At night, he was tormented by nightmares. Not the roar of the explosion, but the deafening, absolute silence that followed. The taste of ash on his lips, and the final, weary gaze of Sergeant Ito. He never told anyone the whole truth, bound by his oath and the bitter understanding that no one would believe him anyway. They would have thought him mad, or a traitor. He slowly wasted away from bone cancer, which his doctors could only explain as unknown consequences of captivity. He died in 1952, in his own bed, surrounded by his family. To everyone, he was a war hero, a man of indomitable will who had survived a Japanese prison camp. But no one knew that his greatest battle, his greatest victory, and his greatest defeat had all occurred during those 7 days on the ruins of a dead city. The fate of Sergeant Ito Kenji remains unknown. His trail was lost in the chaos of post-war Japan. Most likely he shared the fate of thousands of other Japanese soldiers accused of war crimes. He was tried and probably sentenced to death or a long prison term. No one took into account the rambling testimony of an American captain. No one wanted to hear the incredible story of how an enemy became a savior. His name was erased from history. In the memory of a soulless system, he remained only a faceless number, the jailer from the Fukuoka II camp. Their unique experience, their impossible alliance, their common struggle for life were deliberately forgotten. Buried under the weight of official reports, political expediency, and a simple human unwillingness to believe that, in the hell of war, the lines between good and evil, hero and enemy, can blur to the point of being unrecognizable. But, as was later whispered in hospitals, among the doctors and nurses who treated the first survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a strange, persistent legend began to circulate. The official history is written in the ink of the victors. It is simple, logical, convenient, and devoid of uncomfortable, soul-stirring paradoxes. In it, there are heroes and villains, righteous anger and deserved retribution. In the official history, the survivors of the Fukuoka 2 camp were heroically rescued by the American Army and later died from the effects of brutal treatment in captivity. Period. End of chapter. But there is another history, the kind that lives not in sealed archives but in quiet whispers, in half-spoken words, in things left unsaid. The kind that is passed down from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, acquiring details, losing others, but preserving its essence, transforming into a myth, a parable. The story of Captain Miller and Sergeant Ito did not die with them. It seeped through the thick walls of censorship, survived as a soldier's tale, a hospital legend. It was said that among the few who survived at the very epicenter of the atomic hell of Nagasaki, there was a strange, unique group, several Americans and their former Japanese guard. It was said that when a reconnaissance patrol found them, they were sticking together, protecting one another like a pack of wolves. It was said that the American captain, despite his extreme exhaustion, screamed until the end that the Japanese men had saved their lives, that he was a man of honor. But no one listened, assuming he had lost his mind. Among the medics on the hospital ship, USS Mercy, where the first radiation victims were brought, there was a persistent belief that one of the POWs dying of radiation sickness, a hulking corporal, kept repeating the same Japanese name in his deathbed. Delirium, Ito-san, Ito-san. He wasn't cursing him. He was calling for him, as one calls for a friend, a brother, with whom he had shared something terrible and profound. This story became a legend of an impossible, unnatural alliance. A legend about how, when the world crumbles to its foundations and a black, poisonous rain falls from the sky, nationality, skin color, language, and the uniform on your shoulders lose all meaning. Only one thing remains. You are a human being, and next to you is another human being, and you will either help each other survive, or you will die alone. The heroism of these men was not recognized with medals or honors. Their names are not carved on granite memorials. Their story is not a chronicle of a great battle, but a quiet, almost inaudible saga of the victory of the human spirit over total, absolute annihilation. They did not save the world. They did not change the course of the war. They simply managed to remain human at the very moment when humanity itself seemed to have been incinerated in the atomic fire. Their liberation was their end. But their shared struggle, forgotten and erased by official history, became their immortality, their tragic greatness. It is a reminder that even on the darkest, bloodiest pages of history, in the very heart of hatred and cruelty, a spark of compassion and humanity can be found. And that sometimes the greatest enemy is not the one who wears a different uniform and speaks a different language, but the one who makes us forget that we are all made of the same flesh, the same blood, and the same fear of death. Their story is a quiet voice from the ashes that, even decades later, still asks us, was that victory worth such a price? And are we, unlike them, capable of hearing each other before the sky above our heads once again explodes with a blinding, unbearable light?